the assassination of the President John F. Kennedy?
I was in 7th grade in Jackson Elementary School in North End of Newport News, about a block over from where the shipyard, Newport News Shipbuilding is. It's where I went to school. And that day we had been outside, I think, playing, and we came in and the bathrooms were in the basement, and so we went down to the basement before we went up to our room. And I remember being in there, and a girl came running down and saying, "The president's been shot. President Kennedy's been shot." And I thought, that just didn't sound right. I knew his father had been sick, had a stroke and was near death. I said, "Oh, you must be mistaken. It's probably his father that has died." But anyway, we went back upstairs, and pretty soon after we got upstairs, they decided to dismiss early. And they didn't say anything over, they just said we were dismissing early. And the bus people would go first, and then the walkers, and I was a walker, would go second. So all the bus people left, and we were just left, a few of us in the room. And I remember one of my teachers came over to the door, and about that time we were all going, "Is it true? Did President Kennedy be shot?" And he said yes. Well, he didn't say yes, he just looked and he just nodded, because I think they were all on the verge of tears. And so then we were dismissed, and I ran all the way home. I was about a block away, so I ran all the way home. And we live in an apartment building. And so I ran upstairs and went to the door, went in, and my mother was like, "Why are you here?" And I told her what happened, and she said, "Well, I wondered why I could hear all these TVs going." And so with that, we turned on the TV, and of course were riveted the rest of the night watching the details and everything.
Okay.
You're in frame. Awesome. What would you like to talk about?
I'd like to talk about August 8th and 9th of 1974. The Watergate investigations were in progress, and Nancy had been watching them closely. Our boys were in the same Montessori, and we had been dating for several weeks. It was time to move along. On the morning of the 9th, we got our papers together, we got our required blood test and marriage license, and we arranged for our newly arrived minister to marry us that evening. The night of August 8th, Richard Nixon addressed the nation and stated that he would resign the next day at noon rather than be impeached. So while I had lunch at my mother and future mother-in-law's kitchen table, Nixon started his journey to California in a helicopter from the White House lawn. Nancy and I got married that evening, August the 9th, and in just a few weeks we'll be celebrating our 52nd wedding anniversary. That's the end of my story.
Do I give my name?
You don't need to.
Okay.
But some people have, some people haven't. It just doesn't matter. Okay. What would you like to talk about?
I would like to talk about July 18th, 1969. On this day in history, Teddy Kennedy drove off the bridge at Chesapeake and left Mary Jo Kopechne dying in the submerged car. She subsequently died, and his reputation was severely damaged for many, many years. As an elder statesman for our country, he was able to redeem himself and our respect for him. Also on this day, Apollo 11 was hurtling toward the surface of the moon for our lunar landing. 2 days later, Neil Armstrong was to become the first human to step on the moon. We can all remember that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Now, on a more personal note, I was in the hospital giving birth to my son, Bradley. As you can imagine, my two previous historical references paled in comparison to my own situation. It was 19 hours of hard labor, and my first thought was for my hair clip. Someone asked if I would like to see my baby, and it brought me back into focus. Thank you for letting me share my story.
Where were you during the Civil Rights Movement and school integration?
Well, the Civil Rights Movement in the southern states was quite a bit different than it was in the northern states. But GIs, black GIs, flew aircraft and ran tank regiments and served honorably in the course of World War II. But they nearly always served in segregated regiments and segregated units. And that was to be a sort of a prime question then later on. The European countries, France, England, all welcomed black GIs as liberators. And the GIs, when they came home or when they went to training camps, especially across the South, found that they were not so welcomed in all of these neighborhoods. Well, I grew up in the mountains of Virginia. Race was not such a very sensitive issue as it was in the coastal area states of the Southeast. And I went to a church. We had black members, black people who attended. We had a very cordial relationship with my church in Bristol with black ministers. But when I went up to college later in Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, I found that race was a very, very sensitive issue. And I discovered, to my utter shock, something that I'd never been taught in school, and I don't think most people realized it, but there had been a very successful movement in Virginia, well after the Civil War and Reconstruction, to disfranchise all black citizens. Now, in the Reconstruction period, when the Union troops had occupied the South to enforce things like the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, blacks had voted. And I did a master's thesis at Hopkins on the disfranchisement movement in Virginia. And it was very, very shocking. I discovered that in the 1888 election in Virginia, there were more voters in Virginia, even though women were later enfranchised, than there were voters in Virginia in 1956 when Eisenhower was elected. And so I was astonished about that because I believed in the Jeffersonian idea that women were created equal with equal political rights. So anyway, I wrote a master's thesis on it. And then when I finished a degree at Hopkins, I moved to Georgia to go to Emory University. And as a part of that, I decided to go over to get a job and teach and make a little bit of money. And so I went over to Spelman College, which was a black school, one of several black colleges in Atlanta. And the president's a great big tall fellow, and I interviewed with the chairman of the History Social Studies department, and but the chairman was, and he was very pleasant, and he was willing to sign me up to teach part-time at the college, but I had to meet the president. So the president was subsequently appointed as ambassador to Ethiopia, and I'm sure he was good at that. So he asked me very first thing, he says, "What's a little white boy from that elite school over there coming over here looking for a job when that little school will not hire black students to come in and teach their classes?" Well, that was a good question. But then they went on, and he said, "Well, what would your mother say about you teaching about?" I said, "My mother would say, black people have been like mountain people, have been kind of disregarded, and that they're not all rich at all." And so anyway, he pursued a series of questions like that. But he said, "We're having trouble keeping our students straight here." He said, "There's somebody speaking downstairs over in the auditorium this afternoon. You ought to go over and listen to him." So I had heard a little bit about Martin Luther King, and so I went down to listen to King, and he gave, and it was a mixed audience, but what astonished me is that there were a substantial number of black citizens who were there to engage in a march in Atlanta that was scheduled a couple of days later. And so I stayed, and when the meeting was over, I went up to see Dr. King and had a little chat with him. And I said what all Southerners said, you know, going to the streets and marching is a dangerous thing here in the lower South. And I knew it because I had seen armed people actually on the streets of Atlanta. And they all had some kind of a story. And finally I said, you know, Dr. King, I've just studied this business about disfranchisement and in the state of Virginia at Hopkins, and it's over voting. And so if you could just vote, you know, in several states there was a black majority of potential black voters. And so he cogitated over that a bit. And then he invited me to come down to the march. And so I thought we'd have a vast number of college students down there, and there were none. There was the northern supporters who came in who had long hair, and there were very, very middle-class black church members who were out to help him. And he was on one side of the street, and on the other side of the street was a KKK lined up. And these were poor whites from out in the countryside who'd probably been paid to come in and march. And Dr. King had the misfortune of attending a communist training camp up in Tennessee and had pictures of all that. And so, you know, I told him, I said, I don't think that was a wise move. And he said, well, they were the only people who would talk to me and help me. And anyway, the KK boys were what they refer to as good old boys, I guess. And they thought they had found a communist in their midst who was stirring up the docile population of some sort. So, and the police were in the middle of this affair and very uncomfortable about it. And so I was a college student. I was dumb as could be, but I had, looked at the race issue from some angles anyway. And so how exactly that happened, but Dr. King had a contact in the governor's office. And so he suggested that I call and talk with these people. I told him, being on the streets of Atlanta, marching is an invitation, to real problems. All these windows around here and all these ex-Army guys who are sharpshooters, So he took that all in, but I called the name of the mayor's assistant, and Dr. King hadn't thought. He was after a big issue of integration. But I said, there's a good street right over here in downtown Atlanta, in the black neighborhood. It has never been paved. And when it rains, it's mud everywhere. Now, he really invited me to join his movement, but I said, you can demand that street be taken care of. It became famous later on as part of the underground Atlanta, which was, a developed area, a story down from the main street. And so the mayor's office was delighted with that. Yes, we'll finally pave it. And they finally did, but not very well. And then I remembered that the Metropolitan Opera came to Atlanta once a year. It was one time it left the National Urban Center, and they were coming down, the next weekend or so. And they were performing the opera Aida, which is a wonderful story about the Queen of Sheba kind of story, and appropriate. So I said, Dr. King, would you like to go to the opera? And he said, if I could take my wife. And so I went over, I called our contact now. He had them, you know, by the neck, vitally here. And they said, the mayor said, he can have my seats. And King said, I'm going to take, you know, 2 of my friends with me too right here. So I called back, and the mayor said, I'm going to see somebody else's seats. And so, okay. So Dr. King went to the opera that weekend, and I wrote, chair of the history department said, I want you to write all this up. So I wrote a little 1-page summary of something. I was like a graduate student. I should have been able to write something, and I gave it to him. It's somewhere in the Emory archives now. But I did go to the march, and I watched the mechanics of everything working there. And I really felt it was a dangerous scene. I was really, but King wanted to go to Alabama. He wanted to, you know, look the lion in the teeth. But I was really concerned about the security situation because I know there were, you know, issues on all sides of this, particularly white youth were inflamed. But anyway, those are little memories that I have and tucked away somewhere in the gray matter affair. But thank you very much.
Where were you during the Challenger Space Shuttle explosion?
Well, I had to go back and do a little bit of research to figure out like the day and time of the year that it happened. I believe it was in January. I want to say it was 1986. But I was trying to remember. I was at home when it happened, and for some reason I was thinking I should have been at school. So I don't know if we had a snow day that day, or my brother and I occasionally missed the bus because we lived down a half-mile driveway. But we were sitting at home. We'd turned the TV on because we knew that the space shuttle was going up, and my brother and I were really excited about that. So I was like literally 15, 16 years old, somewhere in there, so young, and still in school. But yeah, we were watching it, super excited about it taking off, and the fact that there was a school teacher on board, that was pretty cool. She was the first civilian that I'm aware of that went up into space. And so that was super exciting, but we were watching it, and then, you know, when the explosion happened, we just sat there because I was like, okay, that was kind of, you know, did that thing just blow up? And so everything just got really quiet for a moment, but it was just my brother and I. So I just turned around and looked at him. I said, did it really just, what just happened? So that was hard. And then to being home, and we were latchkey kids, so we were home alone. My parents were already at work. That's why sometimes we did truly miss the bus. Other times we on purpose missed the bus. So I can't remember what was going on that day that we were actually home. But that's where we were when that happened. It was definitely sad because I think it was like one of those, you don't believe what you just saw, and you're not sure if what you just saw really happened. So that was hard. And of course it was sad when, you know, when they finally came back on air and said what had happened, and it was like, whoa, you know, because you just didn't want to believe it. And it kind of reminds me of the 9/11 when that happened too, because I remember the day and time and that exact happening when that was going on, because I was at work. I worked in a gym, and somebody came running upstairs and said, you know, hey, something's going on, you need to turn the TV on. And then I just remember that day, the skies being very quiet. And that was what was challenging that day, as well as the fact that when you hear about the loss of life. So that was very hard. And as a person of faith, it's like, okay, Lord, why do we go through these things? Why do people have to suffer? But I'm also thankful because in the end, you know, seeing people bounce back, seeing real resilience, seeing young people grow up and have a passion for things because they see what other people have either been through or they've in a roundabout way, experienced it themselves. So whether it was something like the Challenger or something like 9/11 happening, is seeing the positive that can come out of such a challenging situation. That's exciting and gives you hope. So when things are hard. So anyways, that's where I was.
This ain't right if we won't do it. Now, the thing is, make sure I ain't cutting part of my face off.
Nope, you look awesome. Okay. So yeah, I'm gonna ask you, where were you? Where were you September 11th? And then I'll point to you. Okay. Where were you September 11th?
I worked in the Pentagon, and that was a normal day for us. We were getting ready to do a staff meeting, so I was in the Pentagon, in my office.
You can talk.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm waiting for my cue here. Anyway, we have a staff meeting every morning, 9 o'clock, and we were just getting ready to do the staff meeting, and we had CNN on in the corner of the room, and the audio turned off, and we see this airplane go into the World Trade Center. We says, "What dumb pilot can't see the building?" And he ran right into it. So we didn't think that much about it, continued with the meeting, and about 9:35, 9:36, there was a loud thump. And we said, "Oh, supply must have dropped a pallet or something here in the Pentagon." So then the fire alarm went off, and which means we had to evacuate the building. Now, we're looking at 23,000 people in the Pentagon, and we all had to get out because we didn't know then what had happened. But it was an orderly evacuation. Everybody went in, out. Most of them went out to the south parking lot of the Pentagon. And by then, the emergency vehicles and the ambulances and you name it had started coming in. Parking lot was jammed. I look up and all I see is black smoke in the sky. Then we find out that an airplane had flew into the Pentagon and hit it. Now, a little bit on the airplane. The airplane had taken off from Dulles, going to Los Angeles. It only had like 50-something people on board. Well, about 5 or 10 minutes after it was airborne, there's 5 terrorists on board that took over the airplane. The pilot didn't know how to land or take off or anything, but he knew how to fly the airplane. But he couldn't find the Pentagon. His mission was to fly the airplane into the Pentagon. Well, the Pentagon is setting into like a swamp, lower level. And you can't see it unless you're right over it, almost. So he gets his map out and he sees that there's a north-south freeway. And if he followed that freeway, he would find the Pentagon, which he did. But he was so low when he was approaching, and once he spotted the Pentagon, he maxed out the power on the engines. Now there's another east-west highway that's almost as high as the top. Pentagon's only 77 feet high. So as they come in to try to get the Pentagon, he got so low his wings clipped a couple of the street lights and took them out. He hit this highway with the airplane and bounced. Instead of hitting the first floor, he hit the second floor. Now the Pentagon is like a wagon wheel. It's got 5 rings around it. This airplane went through on the second floor through all 5 rings. Nose ended up, part of it, in the center court. It killed 125 people. It was mostly Army on that side of the Pentagon. My office is on the east side of the Pentagon on the 4th floor. And my wife worked there also. She's on the 4th floor, northeast. So, okay, back to the evacuation. So I come out of the Pentagon, people, vehicles everywhere. And ran into my wife. She's standing or trying to get out of the Pentagon, and I ran into her. I said, we got to get out of here. So we headed over, crossed the parking lot to Pentagon City. We didn't drive that day, we rode the city bus. So we caught a bus and went home. Meanwhile, the fire department was pouring water. There's a fire started from the airplane. It didn't explode, but it started a fire. And they wet that whole area down of the Pentagon until they got the fire out. Next morning, I was back in my office, and then we had to start cleaning up. There was mold in the Pentagon from all that water. Well, it's a health hazard. If you get that mold, you breathe it, you're in trouble. So it took a couple of days, excuse me, took a couple of days to get that out. And then we had to start clearing out the classified information that was in those offices, because there was classified stuff everywhere. Because people were working, they were doing. So we put our hazmat suits on, went in there and started pulling that stuff out and controlling it. But I remember outside in the parking lot, all the vendors in the local area came in there, and any kind of food you wanted, they gave it to you. So if you can imagine working those long hours and getting hungry and then going to those vendor trucks, it was good. So, yeah, it's not easy to talk about it, I'm sorry. But anyway, we were going to repair the Pentagon in the minimum time. And the limestone blocks that the Pentagon's built out of came from a quarry out west. So we had to bring all the stones in so that everything looked the same. And within a year, we had it all repaired. It was back to so pretty much back to normal. Well, within the year it was. The rest of the Pentagon, there's 17 miles of quarters that you can walk around that Pentagon. But we were back in business. Everything was pretty well normal. So I guess I'll kind of end it there. That's where I was on September 11th.
That's a really cool story.
What do you remember about the first months of the COVID lockdown?
I've been here for 8 years, and I've had many good experiences, but I'll never forget March of 2020. I had just gotten the first permanent in my hair that I had ever had. I walked out to meet my grandson for lunch at the cafe, so he got to see me with curls for the first time. And he's the only one, because that afternoon they shut us down for all those many months for COVID. It was a bad experience.
What do you remember about 9/11?
It was a school day. I was a primary school librarian. At that particular moment, I was in my room recording something on a TV screen, And all of a sudden, that news came on and they were showing it on TV. My husband was also there working on a piece of equipment for me. So he was also there, and we were just stunned. And then the school custodian came in, and the three of us were there watching when the second plane hit the building. We were stunned. We were the only people in the building who knew that it happened. And I wanted to go and tell my other teachers what was happening, but we had to be calm and not put fear in the primary school students that we had. I would go to a class and relieve a teacher and tell her she needed to go and look at the TV. And by that way, we got some of the teachers to understand what it was going on. How they handled it with their children in the classrooms, I don't know, but it was certainly a startling day for me as well as everyone in the country.
What do you remember about the expansion of computers?
Well, I remember when I was in college, 1969, there was a research program going on at 4 universities. And at that time, everybody had their own system. So these 4 universities linked their systems, which became the forerunner to the internet. And as that also in 1969 was the introduction of the first ATM machines. And also what we also had come about was automatic retailing. General Electric came up with a system to do cashiers via automation. So at that time, it was already getting to the point where we had these different facets coming together to where we are today. To be perfectly honest with you, how this affected me is I haven't been in a bank in over a year. Okay, the only thing I went into a bank was to sign some papers. But other than that, my deposits, my transfers are all done online. The only thing I haven't been able to figure out yet is how to withdraw money. I don't think we could print money on our printers at home. So that's someday going to happen. We got the ATM with, doesn't print money, it actually has money, but someday we'll actually be able to print money that's legal tender. When, I don't know. But other things that happened in 1969 was kind of interesting. In addition to that, was that Neil Armstrong was the first man to go onto the moon. That was a result of a lot of computers at the Houston Science Center. And the fact that we have come so far on internet, doing things online, shopping, changed the nature of the country. At one time, your big stores used to be Penny, Sears. I think locally we had Hex. Most of those are either transferred to online shopping partially or adopting a lot of what's happening due to the fact that Amazon has been so successful. Another thing from 1969, I have a few notes here. Some things that happened when I was in college. The top baby names for boys was Michael and David. The average life expectancy was 70.2 years. The #1 song on Billboard was Sugar Sugar by the Archies. Okay, my name's David. I have a cousin, Michael. I'm over 70.2, and Sugar Sugar is one of the most popular songs being played by Amy and Athena at exercise class. That about sums it up. We're at the age of Aquarius now. Everything that happened in 69 is becoming fact now.
Where were you for the Second World War?
Oh, thank you. My name is Harold Wilson, and when the Second War broke out, I was 6 years old, and I lived in the mountains of East Tennessee. And my father had died a few years before, and my sister and I lived with our grandparents on a very happy and sunny little farm. and our mother went off to the city to work, which was the pattern in those days. Now, in December of 1941, our radio, which was a battery-powered radio, came and went in functionality, and in December it wasn't working very well. Now, the military tradition in East Tennessee was fairly great. Everybody remembered the First World War, and a lot of people had fought there, and there was an expectation that events, especially in Europe, would explode, and the United States somehow would get involved in that. But they remembered the story of Sergeant Alvin York, who had made a reputation in the First World War by capturing a whole enemy company of soldiers. And there was a story of David Crockett and Daniel Boone and all of that. The government, by December, had mobilized 1 million men who were in had been in the working camps, agricultural, and these were called CCC camps. And that was kind of ominous. It never had before, and it may not even have been illegal. May have been illegal, yes, but it happened. And then there was news in early December that the Japanese ambassador who had been in a committee who had been in Japan were coming for a special visit with the President of the United States. And some people really took hope in that the disputes in Asia would be resolved, because the United States had been very unhappy over Japanese expansionism, particularly in China. And the military was running the Japanese government. It was a very, very sensitive affair. And so there was hope then that these conflicts would be resolved through diplomacy. And then one day, on December 7th, it was a sunny day, it was Sunday, and we had one of our neighbors come down the street. Actually, it was the road. We were in the country. And from the street, he was very excited, and he said, the great shindig has finally broken out. And what he told us was really surprising, and it upset our families. It did families all across the country. There had been expectation that maybe if any conflict broke out with Japan, it would be in the Philippines. Douglas MacArthur had gone out there and mobilized Filipino forces, and but no one expected the news there had been an overwhelming attack on Pearl Harbor. And the Japanese ambassador had scheduled his meeting with Roosevelt at the Secretary of State Hall, and told him at 12 o'clock, he said, Japanese airplanes are flying over Hawaii right now. And the Secretary of State knew this already because the Japanese codes had been broken down. Now, we were sitting on the front porch, and suddenly we had a whole family, discussion right there on the porch. And for us, our little world, I had gone to a one-room school nearby, and we had learned a little bit of geography, but not much. And so we had to grow up before we ever understood the details. But my uncle, who lived with us, said, I'm going to join. And this was East Tennessee, and it was a tradition. And, in a few weeks, he joined the United States Navy. And so the family decided that my sister and I should go live with an uncle. Now, the uncle was eligible for a draft, the way the draft had been installed in the First World War. And they thought maybe having the two of us, my sister and I, living with him, that would give him additional terms of being immune to the draft, deferred as it was. And that happened. But that was my universe. And the war changed our world. And the family sat down and began to talk through members of our kin, and decide who was going to be eligible, who was going to volunteer, and who was not. And so it was our family, like families everywhere, that was now not exempt from the World War, but suddenly we were all in it together. And so that dominated our early lives, and especially mine. So the war changed America, and it changed politics. Later on, the GI Bill transformed the 20 million people who served in the Army into educated a class. And a part of that class in the Army were the million black soldiers who served in the Army. And they were eligible for the GI Bill, and they were to play a very, very important role then in the civil rights movement that began right after the conflict ended in 1945.
Good.
What do you remember about Queen Elizabeth's coronation?
Well, we had just gotten our very first TV in our home. And of course, the coronation was big news everywhere. And to me, being a young child, I was amazed at the opulence of the fur trains, the crown jewels, because I had never seen anything like that in my life. So it just had me glued to the TV. And they run that coronation for at least a week, almost every single day, about her. And what I remember, she was very young, and I think she had her first child, which was Prince Charles during that time. And all of these events that I have talked about have happened between the very late 40s and the early 50s.
What do you remember about 9/11?
In 1999, I began working as a software engineer and database specialist at the CIA with a team that specialized in tracking terrorist satellite phone conversations in Afghanistan. One day, my boss asked me to interview a potentially new team member, and I asked her what I could tell him about what we do. She said a few months earlier, a government executive bragged on an interview on national television about how the CIA was monitoring bin Laden's phone calls from a satellite phone. Needless to say, that was the last time bin Laden used that phone. We worked in a vault within a vault with computers linked to a satellite receiver in Germany that received and downloaded satellite phone conversations. It also had a database that recorded all call activity. Our team consisted of me, another software engineer, 2 linguists that listened to and transcribed phone conversations, and a team of analysts who monitored and maintained a map of terrorist call activity. Each morning we received latitude and longitude information from the NSA for recent satellite phones that were active in Afghanistan. We used software to develop a network of calling activity which were printed out on a plotter. The output was displayed on a map about 4 foot high and 6 foot wide and showed a network of all known terrorists. There is a huge TV monitor on the wall with a constant display of CNN news traffic. This is what we were watching on 9/11 when the terrorist planes hit New York and the Pentagon. We immediately went active and began monitoring and recording all terrorist phone conversations. Somehow we were able to find rides home that day, and I began working 14 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, for several months. Each day we'd process phone conversations recently received, monitor and update who was talking to who, and each morning forward geographic information for the phones to the military to use for targeting. It wasn't until one day in December that I was able to take a few hours off for a dental appointment. At that point in time, the dust was settling and the terrorist network activity was essentially destroyed. Later that month, we were able to return to a 40-hour work week schedule. This is by far the most intensive and, of course, the most satisfying work I've ever done. And each day, of course, on 9/11, I have to take a few hours off just to remember what we did. And this is a picture of what was at the agency on the walls in the corridor.
What do you remember about the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Okay, I was, in 1989, I was an ROTC instructor over at Norfolk State University. And when we found out about the Berlin Wall coming down, it brought back a lot of emotions, because being in the military, our job was to protect against the Soviets coming across from East Germany, starting World War III. My first 3 years in the Army was on that border between East and West, and while I was there, I remember visiting Berlin and being within a couple of feet of the wall, and just thinking about how poor the people looked on the other side, all the buildings that still were destroyed from World War II, and that was 30 years later, because I was there in 1975. And so when the Berlin Wall came down, it was almost like a sense of relief and mission accomplishment from a military person's perspective. And then, of course, the other reaction was, now what? What's going to happen now? And of course, we all saw what happened over the next few years until the Soviet Union collapsed. But at least in this particular case, it was overall was a positive feeling. And that's it.
What do you remember about the assassination of President Kennedy?
Well, I remember that I was 15 years old when I heard about it. I was living in Chesapeake County, Virginia, which is just south of Richmond, Virginia. And I was in high school at the time. It was the 9th grade, and I was sitting in algebra class, and I just happened to be sitting right behind probably the prettiest girl in the school, and which is why I probably developed a love for math. But in our school we had a public address system, and the principal typically on any normal day would have come on at the beginning of the day and give announcements and that sort of thing for what's going to happen or what's scheduled for the day. But this day was different because during the day the principal came on the public address system and got everybody's attention. Everything got quiet, in the classrooms, in the gym, in the lockers, everything shut down as the principal told us that the president had been shot. And so it was stunning. It was staggering. Everybody was sad. I'll never forget it.
What do you remember about 9/11?
9/11. We were at my wife's hometown in the little town of Gaspé on the peninsula of the Quebec. I was sitting in the dining room watching TV, and all of a sudden I saw these planes crashing into the towers in New York. And we were in Canada. I said to my wife, I wonder how in the world are we going to get home? They may close the borders, they're shutting them down for everybody else. We may not be able to get home. But we decided to go back and drive on into Montreal. We got into Ottawa, and I saw the trucks lined up to go across the Peace Bridge. They were lined up for 20 miles. I says, my Lord, we will never get across the United States. So I spent the night with my brother-in-law in Ottawa, and we got up the next morning and started back, and all the trucks were gone. They'd all crossed the border sometime during the night, and we got there and went right across the bridge. But now they stopped us on the other side and did a superior investigation of my car to make sure there was nothing on it that we could blow up the country with. And that's basically what I remember about 9/11.
Where were you during the launch of television into American homes?
Well, when I saw my very first TV program, I was at my grandmother's house down in Hampton. And I was sitting on a little stool, and she was in the chair up real close to the TV. And this gentleman came on the TV, and I asked my grandmother, I says, "Is he in that box?" And she said, "Shh, no, he's not." So anyway, later I learned that was kind of funny. And at that time, the TV screens were about this big, and they were in this huge box. So you almost had to sit close to be able to see them. And of course, they were black and white. And then a news gentleman came on by the name of John Cameron Swayze. And he had this commercial with a Timex watch, and the little jingle was, "The Timex Timex takes a licking and keeps on ticking." And for some reason, that's always stuck in my mind.
What do you remember about the assassination of President Kennedy?
Okay. At the time, I was 11 years old, 11 and a half. I was in the 6th grade, and I was attending a Catholic school in northeastern Wisconsin. And since most of us were Catholic and Kennedy was the first Catholic president, it was a big deal that he was president. The 22nd of November, 1963 was cold, damp, and rainy outside, so we had to do our recess and our lunch hour indoors in the classroom. So we're playing in the classroom after we ate, and one of the nuns came in and with a look on her face and said that the president had been shot. And we were all shocked, and we didn't really know the significance of what the long-term effect was going to be. So we went ahead and started playing again, and then about a half hour later we found out that he hadn't survived. And we were all within shock. And then I remember that was on a Friday, and I remember on the weekend, Lee Harvey Oswald, they caught him that day at the event of the assassination. And then I remember watching on TV on Sunday when he got shot by Jack Ruby. Then I remember the funeral on Monday the 25th or 26th, whenever it was, along with the famous picture of John Jr. saluting his father. But it was a complete shock, and I'm not sure if anybody really ever recovered from it. And that's mainly what I remember.
What do you remember about 9/11?
The day 9/11 happened, we were doing an estate sale in Kings Mill in Williamsburg. There were no TVs, no radio. We had no idea what was going on until we got ready to leave, and there was a gentleman there to pick up the trash, and he said, "How can you all work today? Don't you know what's going on?" And we had no idea, and he filled us in as to what had happened. The traffic was awful coming home, and we were glued to the TV after that, watching everything that went down, and it was just unbelievable. But the estate sale people didn't call us to tell us to leave or anything, so we worked all day long getting ready, not knowing what had happened.
What do you remember about 9/11?
I remember it like it was yesterday. We were getting ready to go play golf, and I saw on the television, on the Today Show,
that a plane had hit the tower. So I thought it was an accident. We got to the golf course and heard that a second plane had hit another tower. So we knew then that it wasn't an accident. We got on the golf course, my husband and I and friends, and one of the rangers on the golf course told us another plane had hit the Pentagon. So then we knew it was a real disaster. We decided we couldn't play, and we went home. I spent the rest of the day glued to the television, crying. And I think I spent 2 days glued to the television. And then I had this overpowering need to connect with my sons, who I knew weren't there and weren't involved, but I just felt that I had to connect with somebody that I loved. And we were getting ready to move into a new house, and it kind of dampened that euphoria that we felt about that. So that's what I remember.
What do you remember?
It was a summer day, and my father came to pick me up at summer camp in Erie, Pennsylvania, helped me lay down in the back of the car, and away we went to come home. When we hit downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the horns were blowing, whistles were blowing, people were screaming. We didn't know what was going on. And my father turned on the radio, and lo and behold, the Emperor of Japan had just surrendered to all of us, so the war was over. It was 1945, August 14th, and I was coming home from camp with whooping cough.
Where were you during the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Well, that's a good question, and I've had the opportunity of living in 17 different states and in 6 different countries. So you asked me an easy question that comes up pretty hard to answer, was where I was. Prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was in 1989, I had been there in 1986 looking for a place to reside with my family, my wife and I. I was in the military at the time, in the intelligence business, and I was being asked to go occupy a job inside of Berlin, which was basically watching out for what the East Germans were doing in and around the Berlin Wall. And so I was there in Berlin 1986, and this wonderful house built back in the 1800s was, well, I think it had 6 basically different apartments in it, and they were all for government dignitaries who wanted to go to Berlin, and then instead of staying at a hotel, they would stay at this nice little mansion. And so I went and looked around, and then ran across an old shipmate of mine who gave me a piece of the Berlin Wall. And there was a section at the Berlin Wall that was a small open gate, and it was for East Germans, children, kids, school age, to go into the other side of the Berlin Wall where they were allowed to go to school. And so there's this wall, but then there was an opening in the wall for kids going to school. And this little rock here is from that opening. And a friend of mine, also in the intelligence business, is the one who gave this little piece of rock to me. And obviously I've had it for quite a few years now, and it sort of sits on my desk or someplace else in my apartment, and people frequently look at it and say, "What's that rock doing there?" And so I get to give them a little story about where it came from and how I managed to get it. That job that I was going to interview, in a sense, for, I finally decided not to do it because my wife would be living with me in this big old mansion, but she would be the one responsible for morning breakfast and that sort of thing for all of these government dignitaries that would come to the Berlin Wall. She didn't want to do that, and I understood that for sure. And so finally said, no, thank you. And of course, that was 1986, which I've already mentioned. 1989 is when the wall came down. And of course, some of us can remember back that far. But what I was doing after that period of time, well, I was still in the government intelligence business, and working on all sorts of different interesting projects, most of which I'm not allowed to talk about, even after death. I signed the little papers that said, "Oh, I'll go to jail if I talk about this or that." So I just sort of mumble around them. My wife used to say, "Oh, he never says a word. He just sits and is quiet. But then when he starts to talk, he never shuts up." And so I've always learned I better shut up when I'm getting around one of those very sensitive topics. And so anyway, that's the period of my life that I guess I'm reflecting on. And as anyone else, there's plenty of reflections. And this is just one that sort of came back to me because of the rock that I have on my desk in my apartment here in the Chesapeake.
Where were you during the launch of television into American homes?
Way back, a couple of scientists decided, let's see if we could make something called a TV. Lots of experiments. By the 1930s, we had labs actually doing experiments. And in 1939, at the New York World's Fair, RCA had a pavilion, and it featured the new TV for the American home. After that, of course, lots of things happened. Most of us were there, we remember. I remember vividly sitting around listening to the radio, Fibber McGee and Molly, all kinds of good things. And then I started going down to the neighbors to watch what? On Tuesday night, Milton Berle, which was on for a number of years. And then my father seemed to think, well, maybe having me at home was a better idea. So at some point, I want to say the very early 50s, we also got a TV. And of course, it changed things, I imagine, in most American homes. We now owned, a TV tray. That was a 50s concept. And in the 50s is when Swanson first came out with TV dinners. So there were lots of different changes that happened. Later on in life, when the year my son was born, we got to watch Man Walk on the Moon for the first time. So there have been a lot of amazing things that have happened, from TV shows that we loved. Meet the Press came on the air back in '47, and it's still running. So there's been all kinds of things. As far as the American home goes, I imagine a lot of people who bought that first TV, they rearranged their furniture. They spent less time doing and more time sitting and watching. I know my mother went from listening to a soap opera called The Guiding Light on the radio while she cleaned house, and then the next thing you know, she's sitting watching it on TV. It was one of the first soap operas on TV. Of course, in those days, they were only 15 minutes. Now they've worked up to an hour. But TV has had probably a more positive than negative influence. I think they're using it in schools now for education. So my evaluation was it's been a good thing, and it's certainly been a part of most of my life and probably many other people's as well.
Where were you during the beginning of school integration?
I was in Hampton High School, and I was a senior, I believe. I don't know, Hampton High was, last year they were the old school, so that's where I was.
Where were you during 9/11?
I was in my living room in Poquoson, and I was getting my children ready to go to school, and they had turned on the TV, and I saw this airplane flying across, and it went into a building. Well, I thought it was something, something that somebody had thought up, that it was a funny thing. And then my phone started ringing, and all my neighbors said, "What happened?" And that's when we found out it was not a funny thing. That's when they first attacked the Twin Towers. And so we stood there and watched it just out of pure horror, because we couldn't believe that anybody would do that. But they did. And I've forgotten how many people were killed, but it was many, many.